As we know, supply chain and operations don't just affect widgets and dollars. They affect people, the employees, the customers, and the communities where we live. They also affect the environment. So I would like to next invite our Salzberg honoree, Dr. Charles Corbett, to share his insights on the connection between operations and well-being. Please welcome Dr. Charles Corbett.
So first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much again, of course, to all of you for being here today, and to the entire team here at Whitman, to Julie, everybody else in the program for the incredible honor of the award. I mean, I'm really incredibly humbled and touched. I should also thank Aydin for the introduction. So many of you weren't here, but I feel like I need to take a 5-minute rebuttal for all the things that Aydin was saying about me earlier, but I won't do that. But I will spend a bit of time talking indeed about the operations and well-being, and well-being in a very broad sense of the word. So we'll talk about well-being as individuals, so us as individual people, what makes us happy, well-being of groups, what's fair, what's unfair for different groups of people, and well-being of the planet and of society at large. So you can see I'm being very loose about the term well-being here, but I hope you'll forgive me for being just a little nervous about talking about those kinds of topics here, because when I just did a bit of research before coming, I realized, in fact, there's an awful lot of work being done right here at Whitman on those exact topics. So Dean McKelvey, for instance, who was here just now, right, he actually is a leader in the space of well-being. He published on that as part of his leadership style. Right? It's very hard to disagree with the notion of just be nice to people. I wish a lot more people would do that. And then Vice Chancellor Haney was recognized by Time Magazine for the work he does on equity. And there's many others here at the Whitman School that programs around well-being and mental health and so on. Many faculty who do work on well-being, on equity, on sustainability. In fact, I use some of Julie's work in the Operations MBA core course that I teach for students around well-being of individuals. So there's really, I think, a clear, so strong, deep, broad commitment to looking at these links between well-being and operations here in the school. And that's actually also quite consistent, I gather, with one of the premises of the Salzberg program. So among others, with the last line of that top part there, you see the Salzberg program is really about stimulating the best effort of all. Right? In a way, it's about helping individuals make the most of themselves. Right? Now, that sounds maybe somewhat obvious or trivial. And what I find so frustrating and disappointing is just how many organizations keep getting in our way of doing that. And when you look around, and this is true at UCLA, I mean, we're no better than anybody else, but if you look at the amount of time that many of us spend just doing stupid stuff, and then having to do stupid stuff again because the stupid stuff wasn't done right first time, it's just the amount of ways in which we get in our own way and just aren't actually able, right, to get the best effort of all. There's just tremendous opportunities for operations, right, to either make us unhappy or happy. Right? And in fact, that's why I was also so delighted to see that on the program today, we have two organizations that are just incredibly well known and respected for precisely trying to avoid that. Right? We heard from Toyota already, and the whole premise of the Toyota production, in a way, is try not to do stupid stuff, right? And do less and less, but they get better and better all the time. But I know I'm massively misphrasing it, but in a way, that's a big piece of it. And then later on, we'll hear from the Good Jobs Institute, where very much, again, it's about the link between making operations just do the stuff it's supposed to do and do it well. And not only does it make companies happier or richer and more profitable, it makes the people who work there just a lot happier as well. So there's so many different connections between operations and well-being. So when I said that there's just all these different ways in which we get in our own way and do stupid stuff, let me just give a few quick little examples. So I don't know how many of you use Microsoft Word, but it's in quite a few of you, right? So very often when you open a document, the first thing you see is that little pop-up, and it's only there for about 2 seconds or so, but it's there almost every time. And I don't know about you, it drives me absolutely insane that every single time I have to sit there and stare at that thing and I can't start doing what I want to do. Now, but you might say 2 seconds, not a big deal. Microsoft estimates that they have about 1 billion users of Word. That's probably an overestimate. But let's say that every person opens one document a day. That's probably an underestimate. So that adds up to about 60 plus years of human life that gets spent every day by people staring at that little pop-up, right? Now, I don't know what kind of calculations Microsoft did, but I doubt very much that they consciously decided that it's in society's best interest to basically flush 60 years of human life down the drain every day so we can look at a little pop-up that I think most of us don't use, right? Some bad operational decision. Here's another one. You take the train from London to Paris, fantastic experience, very smooth under the tunnel, right? Great, right? Fantastic engineering, super state-of-the-art, everything. You get to the station in Paris, to Gare du Nord, and then you want to take a taxi, and this is what you see, right? So there's a whole line of people there waiting to get in the taxi, and at the same time, there's a whole line of taxis there waiting for a person, right? Now, if you didn't put a fence in between, right, you could have 10 taxis be loaded at the same time, and this would be very quick and efficient. Some genius came up with the idea of putting that fence and creating an unbelievable artificial bottleneck, forcing us to load one taxi at a time. So you can be in line for half an hour, already knowing exactly what taxi you're going to get into, but you can't get in there because some genius put that fence there. Right? I'm sure there's some kind of a lazy safety excuse or whatever, but to me, this is just a horribly bad operational decision. Right? Well, here's another bad design decision. I don't even think I need to say much, right? It's you know, we laugh about these things, but as the world's population is getting older and older, and people have a harder time reading, and well, more people with arthritis and so on, these things are actually problematic for a significant chunk of the population. Right? So anyway, I could go on. There's just all these sort of little sort of operational things that we do, little decisions that we make, many of which seem trivial, but collectively they actually really affect so whether we're happy or unhappy. So that's the theme I want to talk about a bit. Now, in operations and supply chains, it's clear that there's a lot of very obvious direct connections between, say, what we do as operations and supply chain professionals and well-being outcomes. But people who work in healthcare supply chains, it's obvious that what they do has an impact on outcomes. But people who work in humanitarian logistics, it's obvious that there's an immediate outcome. Right? So what I want to focus on more is the less obvious ones, so the indirect connections that we may often not think about. And hopefully sort of stimulate some more thought and awareness about what are all the sort of accidental mistakes that we may not realize we're making. And I'm sure I'm making just as many of them as anybody else. So just a quick disclaimer. So effectively, nothing I'm going to say here is new. This is all based on research that's been done over some different disciplines, different years. And it's going to be a super, super wide and very, very shallow talk. But hopefully, by being very, very broad, there'll be something that resonates for anybody, no matter what field you're interested in. So let's say that we have some understanding of what well-being means, right? For what makes us individually happy, what's fair, what's sustainable for society, for the planet. How does all of this connect back to operations? And to give you some examples of that, what I'll do is I'll just go through a range of different sectors, very different ones, some manufacturing type industries, some more service type ones, and then some more knowledge sectors. And I just start going through some examples of these connections between operations and well-being. To give it some structure, I'll try and divide the field of operations and supply chains into some of the domains that we tend to focus on a lot. So in the operations and supply chain world, but we spend quite a bit of time worrying about things like pace and productivity. How fast can we do things? How efficient are we? We also spend a lot of time worrying about the effects of uncertainty, right? So how do we deal with probability? How do we make things more predictable? We spend a lot of time thinking about contracts in supply chain. How do we perform and reward people? We spend a lot of time, of course, on designing good processes and trying to prevent problems from happening. And then there's a lot of effort around how do we avoid pollution? How do we protect people? How do we protect the planet? But, of course, you can tell I'm joking a bit here with trying to come up with as many things with a P as possible. So for many of you who have taken a marketing class, I suppose, and you've been introduced to the 3 or the 4 Ps of marketing. I just wanted to make the point here that we in operations are at least 2 or 3 times ahead of the marketing field in terms of, say, the 10 Ps or more of operations. So as soon as you have this, 3 levels, 5 or more domains of operations, and inevitably, as academics, we like to stuff things into a matrix. So that's essentially what the structure would look like. But what I'm not going to do is sort of start plugging in all the cells of this matrix. I think that would be very boring. But what I hope you'll agree by the end of the talk is that so no matter what domain of operations you're interested in, there actually are these sort of hidden, unanticipated links between what we do in operations and well-being of individuals, of groups, and of society. So that's essentially the roadmap that we'll be going through. So let me start with just giving some examples. And so just to be clear, I have no experience actually working in a meatpacking plant. I don't know if any of you do, but I've been told it's one of the most miserable places you can possibly work. Luckily, we have ethnographers, people who actually go and live in these places, who describe in great detail what life is like in all kinds of different settings. So this is based on an ethnography by Deborah Fink, who spent a year and a half or so working in meatpacking plants in Iowa, describing the conditions there that people were facing. So first of all, right, in meatpacking, so when you're basically preparing meat to be sold in grocery stores, there's two objectives which are in conflict with each other. So on the one hand, you want to get as much meat off the bone as possible, but at the same time, they want you to cut as fast as possible. And of course, if you start cutting too fast, you're going to leave more meat on the bone, so there's more waste. So there's an immediate tension there between, say, the productivity and the pace objectives. The conditions there are just appalling, but one particularly salient story that was told here was that these plants supposedly have all kinds of safety and so practices in place. But how good is that when they take in all kinds of people, so in this case, a recent immigrant who didn't speak a word of English, but was put through the English language safety program, and then after 10 minutes of being put on a new part of the production line, had a horrible accident, right? And you can say, well, yeah, we have safety procedures, but clearly these are not actually protecting the people that they're meant to protect. And there's all kinds of other stuff happening there. You might think, well, this surely has been fixed by now. And one of the things we learned during COVID, there were just this endless series of stories that doesn't seem like working in a meatpacking plant has got any better since that particular ethnography was written. So let's look at assembly lines. And this is, given the huge micron investment that's coming here, this is perhaps one of the closest to a lot of jobs that are going to be emerging in this area. Is right in assembly lines around semiconductor manufacturing and others. So in assembly lines, there's a different kind of tension where in a traditional assembly line, that everybody has to work at the same speed, almost by definition. But when you look at the workers on that line, there's very often, there are some people who want to make as much money as possible. So they want the line to go as fast as possible. They want to get their bonus at the end of the shift. And there's other people who basically want to just be somewhat more relaxed. They're willing to work, but they don't want to be stressed out, and they want to have time for their breaks, but they're all on the same line. So you're inevitably going to end up with tension between these same people because of disagreements about what's for them the optimal pace of work. So again, there's lots of ethnographies of what life is like on assembly lines. And one of them did a very nice comparison of two different companies. One of these companies was very well run, the good practice that they were doing just in time, and they were doing it well. And the other one was claiming to do just in time, but doing it very, very poorly and just making a complete mess of things. So in that particular plant, the workers would say, this is not just in time. This is Japan-induced terror. It's complete chaos on the line. But what you see happening is if things are not working the way they're supposed to, well, first, the workers get very demoralized. It's frustrating. But also, let's say that you're running late and you're not going to be able to deliver to your customer in time. Well, then they start picking up the phone to call the customer and ask, hey, you know what, we're going to be a day late with our delivery. Is that okay? And as soon as you have these kind of personal phone calls going on, you start to depend on personal relationships between people. And as soon as that's the case, of course, you open up the door for all possible kinds of biases and favorable or unfavorable treatment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even though an assembly line might look like a relatively objective, factual thing, right, if it becomes a poorly run, chaotic assembly line, right, biases, discrimination, other things can start creeping in before you know it. Okay? And now, so we've been studying assembly lines and pace and productivity forever, right? This goes back to Frederick Taylor, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. There have been studies on the effect of mass production and lean since more than 100 years back. One of the one of the main findings from that big research literature by now seems to be that now if you apply principles of lean production, but there's many terms, but some people would call that the Toyota production system, but that's not entirely accurate, but there's a lot of overlap, right? You can say lean production, just in time, whatever. But essentially, typically that does increase the sort of the expectations on that system. But if that's done in a way where the workers are also given the tools that they need and the system works well, they actually thrive and they enjoy the increased expectations and they can deliver and things go well. So good implementations of lean operations can be actually good for the workers as well as good for the company. Many companies, though, are not very good at implementing lean and they only do half of it. They'll pick a few pieces that sound cool and they'll forget some of the other parts. And very often they'll forget some of the parts that we heard earlier from Toyota about the culture and the philosophy. So what they end up doing is implementing partial lean, which is just a disaster. And then you get now people who are frustrated, upset, there's chaos on the line, and people are just miserable. So when you hear stories about lean production or lean operation doesn't work, but most of the time it's because the execution was very poor, more than that the principles are not good. All right, now there's a whole new supply chain emerging. It's completely invisible, but many of you are in the supply chain field or entering the supply chain field. And we tend to think of physical supply chain, but more and more, there's also digital supply chains. With the rise of artificial intelligence, there's this whole human supply chain behind AI that we don't really see very much, but is increasingly important. There's millions of people around the world who are doing very human labor to do data labeling and annotation and speech annotation and content moderation and all kinds of things like that in supply chains that look just like supply chains for fashion or for other things, except they're supply chains for data. And because it's invisible and because it's dispersed around the world, all kinds of very questionable practices happen in these supply chains. So when you want to have a socially responsible AI, not just about the outcomes of the AI, it's also about how did you produce the AI and train it in the first place. So there's time pressure where people who are content moderators have to make decisions about what content is acceptable. They have to do that fast. But also these content moderators, but if you think about the unbelievable amount of complete garbage that's already on the internet, right, and the filth and everything, right? There are people who have to screen out the stuff that's even worse that never made it to the internet, right? So at YouTube, for instance, apparently they decided at some point that the screeners, who basically have to spend their whole day looking at the worst possible hate speech and violence and pornography or whatever, that it's okay for them to do that for 4 hours a day, but no more. Now, I don't know about you, but I think if I had to look at that stuff 4 hours a day, my brain would be fried in a week. Right? And we really don't know what it means to protect these people from all the psychological damage that's involved with their work. Now, finally, in this world, in the world of, say, ghost work, cloud work, whatever you call it, right, Mechanical Turk, M-Turk, and others, or gig work in the cloud, this is often sold as being a huge benefit to underprivileged populations around the world because it gives them flexibility, it gives them access to work that they might not otherwise have. Now, and there's some truth to that. But the reality is often, in fact, the reverse, that it's the people who enjoy these kinds of things as a second source of income, like people who drive Uber just to get some extra money to go to Hawaii. But those people can work when it suits them. They can cherry pick the best jobs and actually get the benefit of that flexibility. But the people who depend on this work for a living, they end up having to basically to scrape the barrel and do the worst possible jobs. And it's actually not at all beneficial. It's very, very damaging for them. So even though we think that this is good work for these people, is actually the people who need the predictability just don't get it at all. So let's have a quick look at some service settings. So flight attendants, well, we all know we all think we know what that job looks like. But there was some work around emotional labor that started with flight attendants. And what the observation there was that even though the job looks the same for different people, it isn't. And for instance, on average, right, if a passenger is nervous, right, or if you have a baby on board that just doesn't want to stop crying, right, on average, people are more likely to go to seek reassurance or help from a female flight attendant than a male. Right? I'm saying on average. So, well, okay, so be it. That's, I guess, part of the difference in the job. But now, what all the airlines are always looking for ways to reduce the cabin crew. Right? And now you might think, well, if you go from 10 attendants to 8 attendants on a given size of airplane, well, that's a fair, so it affects everybody, but it affects everybody equally. But it doesn't. Because if now the flight attendants have less time to do this kind of emotional labor, right, it's the ones who are expected to do this emotional labor who are negatively affected. Right? So now suddenly, after reducing the cabin crew size, right, it looks like they're not doing their job well anymore, whereas others are not affected. So even though this looks like a completely neutral and fair efficiency measure, it actually affects different people very differently. And we need to be very mindful about this. Not just true in flight attendants, right? This is for nurse staffing ratios and many, many other settings too. So ambulance crews, there's another it's an interesting part of the healthcare supply chain, because in healthcare, we like to come up with all kinds of different policies about how we're going to prioritize and allocate resources, et cetera. But what's often missed is that the actual policies are made on the ground by the first-line workers, by the frontline workers, right? And they may or may not actually do what the administrators and managers and bureaucrats think that they do. So just one example is that in ambulance crews, and this is based on ethnography on a big county in California, there might be policies about saying if you pick up a patient in this neighborhood, you need to take that patient to the closest hospital that's available. But if that's a busy neighborhood with lots of calls, or the crews might sometimes say, you know what, I'm just going to drive a little bit further to a different hospital that might be in a wealthier neighborhood that's quieter and less likely to get calls. And then once we're there, because now we're further away, we're also less likely to get the next call. So we have a bit more peace, but we're going to have just a more quiet evening, right? And if you don't actually follow the workers, you don't see these kinds of deviations in the policy, but they're the ones who are actually deciding on the ground what happens, right? I'll skip call center, but you can imagine this is another job that's there's just constant time pressure and ambiguity. And then repair technicians. And if you think about the job of repairing, whether it's photocopiers, computers, whatever it is, almost by definition, it's very hard for the customer to observe the quality of the work. Right? You can tell if the machine worked, but beyond that, you can't tell, did they actually fix the repair or did they just make it work for a few hours? So when you try to evaluate the quality of the work, what you end up doing is evaluating the relationship you have with the person. Now, again, you might say that sounds fine, but now what do we do in operations and supply chain? We like to do things like pooling. So we like to say, let's take a larger region and pool all our repair technicians across a larger region so we can have more people available at different points in time. But what we're doing at that point is we're breaking these relationships between customer and technician, which immediately impacts, in fact, the way that these technicians end up being evaluated, because we actually don't know how well they're doing. So, and there's many other settings where measuring performance is becoming hard. It's a huge problem for us in academia, just measuring how well do we do as teachers. We tend to rely on these student surveys because it's easy, but it's a very poor metric of actual quality of teaching and effectiveness, but because it's so hard to actually measure. Right? So how about in knowledge sectors? You might think, well, software and so on. That should surely not be subject to all these kinds of humans, of strange behaviors and biases and so on. But even there, the same things happen. So take an extreme example of open source software. Right? So these are people who don't even know each other. It's just out there. It's in the internet. I know people are contributing pieces of code to R, to Python, whatever. And you think, surely this is just based on merit. It turns out even in that world, your value and your status as a creator, as a software developer, depends very much on sort of the cultural background that you bring and shared understanding of cultural references. So even there's a lot of human aspects to it that we often forget. And very often in this world, time pressure leads us to make very bad decisions. So there's this example of an NGO that really wants to improve health. And they do the right thing. They include all the different stakeholders of the communities that they're trying to affect to understand what is it that we need to do to actually to improve global health for the stakeholders. But then it turns out that They don't invite the most critical groups just because, well, we want to get the feedback, but we don't have time to do anything with it, so we're just going to leave them out. And that's something you see all over the place, is that time pressure very often leads us to do basically make bad decisions. Let's say really bad design decisions like this because we didn't think long enough, but you can't get it right. So here's just, let's just take the right one. An example of a design question or a decision that was really thought through. So when you're designing intersections, right, you press the button to get the green light, but how much time should the pedestrian light stay green? Right? Now, if you let it stay green for long enough for every single member of the population to cross, right, that light's always going to be green and the traffic stops. You can't do that. So let's say you time it so that 80% of the population can get across during the green light. Well, how about the other 20%? They're going to get honked out, run over, right? So how do you solve this problem? Well, what Singapore did is they basically designed a two-tier system. So I don't know what the threshold is, but let's say they set it for 80%. So the default is 80%. But if you are disabled or elderly or have a baby stroller and you need more time, you get a little magnetic card that you hold against there, which buys you extra time. So by designing the system to allow for different degrees of ability, you can actually be much more inclusive. Right? But it takes a bit of time to think about these things. There's many other industries. Like many of our students come out of finance and go into finance. I guess that's the same there. And it's just, it's mind-boggling how badly run the finance industry is. And just when you see people just working 3 days straight, and then they're expected to proofread IPO documents and not find, and it has to be perfect. There can't be a single error in it. And then they get beaten up if they miss something, but didn't sleep until Monday. It's just, the operations of Wall Street are about as bad as it gets, and I have no hope or illusion that that's going to change anytime soon. But it has a lot to do, again, with time pressure that's artificially imposed. So so getting things right and trying to prevent problems is a big part of what we do in operations. So let me give just the last industry example, and this is one that's close to home in the movie industry in LA, where we did a study on sustainability in the movie industry some years ago. And there's lots of people in that industry who really care, right? They're really passionate about environmental and social issues. But the way the industry works, it's chaos. And very often, nothing happens for years, where projects are being shopped around. And then suddenly, when all the approvals come together, everything has to happen yesterday. Right? So it's this incredible stop and go mode. And it's very hard to make good decisions and be sustainable in that world. So let me contrast two movies, and you may well know these. So you recognize the movie on the left, The Terminal? So many of you have seen that one? Yeah, so this is Tom Hanks. And he arrives at JFK International Airport from a country, a small country that doesn't actually exist. And during the flight, that country suddenly ceased to exist. Right? There was some civil war or something or other. So when he lands, his passport is useless. So he cannot leave JFK. He can't get past immigration. So the entire movie is shot at the JFK International Airport. Now, wait a minute. You mean they shut down the whole airport for 6 weeks to shoot the movie? No, of course not. Right? What they did is they rebuilt the entire JFK International Terminal in Palmdale in California, just outside Los Angeles. Shot the whole movie. So all the scenes that you see in that movie are in fact in Palmdale. And then when they were finished, they destroyed it. Right? Now, if you look at that picture, so look at the, if you look at the tiles here, these are actually beautiful granite tiles, polished and everything, but they glued these tiles to the floor. So when they were finished, they couldn't lift them and reuse them. They just had to grind everything up. And a company called the Reuse People of America says that if they thought this through, they could have put those tiles on rubber bases. It would have been just as good. Then they could lift them up afterwards and reuse them. And the same would be true for many other parts of the set. But instead, they were in a rush. They destroyed the whole thing. Contrast that to the one on the right. So this is the second of the Matrix series, because many of you have seen that series. But you remember the insane freeway chases? Yeah, I see you nodding. It's mind-boggling. That freeway was also built for the movie. Right? It's about a 2 or 3 mile section of freeway that was built in Alameda. Just for the purpose of the movie. But for this one, they actually did plan ahead very carefully, so that all the construction, right, all the concrete, the wood, and everything that was used was recycled. The wood was actually shipped to Mexico to make affordable housing. So if you have time to think things through, you can actually make very sustainable decisions. But if you're in a rush, it just doesn't happen. And even now, you may have been following this tragedy in New Mexico a few years ago about this accidental shooting that Alec Baldwin accidentally killed a member of the crew because the gun that he thought was not loaded turned out to be loaded. But now that the lawsuits are still flying around, we don't know exactly what happened, but it certainly looks like there was a lot of rushed, careless production going on there too. Right? So, right, if we're trying to do the right thing, trying to protect people, prevent pollution, we have to have the right operations, and we have to slow down and take time to think things through. Now, you might say, but the whole world is moving towards information, but the physical stuff doesn't matter. It's all about information. But actually, think about data spills. It's really just like another form of pollution. Right? And not only that, most data spills happen in the supply chain. As I mentioned earlier, that data is becoming an information supply chain. But several of the big hacks have happened over the last few years at Target, Home Depot, and others. The actual entryway was not directly at Target. It was through the air conditioning vendor of Target, of all places. And they broke in through there and somehow were able to access Target's credit card systems and get access to all kinds of data. So what it suggests is that when we have supply chains, we focus a lot on the physical supply chain, but there's so many interconnections of data that we don't see and don't map, but there's incredible vulnerabilities there that we need to be aware of. And to make it worse, right, who are the people who are affected by these kinds of things? Now, by and large, right, if our data gets leaked and there's identity theft or whatever, for any one of us, I'd say it's annoying, it's a headache, but we'll deal with it. For people who live paycheck to paycheck, right, all it takes is for one check to bounce. Right? One rent payment, and they can be living on the street the next month. Right? So these kinds of data hacks can be absolutely life-changing for people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. But the people who are designing these systems are not those same people. So we just completely undervalue and underweigh, right, the life-changing impacts that it can have to actually invest in security in our data supply chains. Right? So yeah, I can keep on going, but I hope that I've convinced you by now that so no matter what field of operations you're interested in, right, there's all kinds of things that we do or don't do that will actually impact us individually, as groups, or as a society. So what could we do about that? So whenever you're doing analysis, running regressions, playing with data, we often think about, no, the residuals are annoying. We want to minimize the residual, get a good fit, but no. Hang on, right? That residual is perhaps an individual. It's perhaps a real person. Don't try to minimize it. Treat it as a person. Right? Or like we like to optimize stuff all the time. You have objective functions, but always when you have an objective function, ask yourself what's missing, what's not in the objective function, and who else is going to be affected by that. Right? We like to do revenue management and pricing, right? But always, right, revenue management by definition is price discrimination. Well, fine to some degree, but keep in mind that there's a very fine line between price discrimination and outright discrimination. Just because we see things that are happening, practices that are apparently accepted, like these horrible practices in meatpacking plants, just because they happen, just because they're accepted, doesn't mean it's acceptable. Right? Just because we have people working in the upstream AI supply chain under terrible conditions, doesn't mean we should accept that. And when we're designing stuff, right, try to design to be inclusive, not exclusive. Just take the time, slow down, and do it right. So how can we do that? Education's a big piece, and that's why you're all here, right, to be educated, and that's a very big part of it. The best thing really is go look. Right? And one of the many things that's associated with the Toyota production system is the philosophy of Gemba. Right? Go look on the shop floor, go see for yourself, go see what's happening. And you should always try to do that. But if you can't, there actually are other ways of trying to find out what you're doing affect, and how is that affecting others. And then last, try to have some empathy. Try to think about what you do. Right? Try to put yourself in the shoes of people whose decisions you're affecting, even people that you may not always think of. So with that, I'll stop there for now. And then, like I said, it's super, super wide, very shallow. But I hope that at least there were some connections, almost regardless of what sector you're going in. And I hope at least to give some food for thought for how we can actually make operations better and help operations to make all of us just happier people going forward as well. And basically, I guess the argument or the question here is, can we just all stop doing stupid stuff? So with that, I'll stop right there and then see if there's any questions. But thank you very much again for coming today.
So we'd like to entertain any questions you may have for Professor Corbett. Questions?
So it was a lot to think about. And I think, how do you get people to start thinking more in this larger holistic way? Because I think a big part of this is, is it habit? Is it unawareness?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if there's any one single way. I mean, the fact that I've been in this job now for 28 years, and it's only now that I'm starting to ask these questions also suggests that these things are not obvious and not trivial, right? But I think part of it is just being very mindful of, of how you use your time in general and trying to slow down or think about what you're doing. And surprisingly, a lot of it has to do with the time management practices that allow you to just slow down and not waste time on things that you don't need to do, but to actually focus on the things that are important. So there's lots of little things that come up, like decision fatigue was something that came up a lot during the pandemic. That we spend way too much time making the same decision over and over and over again. And that exhausts us. And then when we're tired, we don't actually have time to step back and think about the things that are really important. So let's try to make as few decisions as possible. Right? Just don't make the decisions you don't need to. So one famous example of that is Steve Jobs wearing the same outfit every single day. And he claims that was because if he didn't have to spend time thinking about what to wear, he could focus on building Apple. Right? So there's slowing down, making less decisions. For me, for instance, just simple examples of things like trying to use zero inbox for email is that actually not spending time rereading the same email over and over again. But everybody will have their own practices. But being conscious of how you use your time and how you waste it, I think is one piece that will help us sort of get towards that.
Kind of like lean thinking. Kind of lean your thinking up so you're not overthinking stuff. It's kind of like lean thinking, so you're not overthinking stuff from a lean perspective.
Yeah, and in fact, it's interesting.
Just in time thinking, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm glad you say that, because actually there's beautiful parallels between lean thinking and good time management practice. I mean, that's a whole separate talk, but the way that we manage our time and the way that we manage operations actually have an awful lot to do with each other. So thank you.
Anything else? Yes.
Obviously, it's important for companies to be impactful when talking about emotional labor, but how do you think the education of future business leaders can change in order to create that a culture within all businesses?
Asking how can future leaders sort of change the mindset to be more reflective about these kinds of things? Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a simple answer. I mean, part of it is just awareness, right? Just being aware that almost every decision we make and everything we do has consequences, and probably more consequences than we think of immediately. I think it really helps a lot. And so I know it's easy to say, right? Slow down. But we all do have some degree of agency over how much we let ourselves be swept up by others around us, and it's challenging when you're starting, right, in your career, and the people around you essentially are setting the norm, right? They're expecting you to work in certain ways, but I see more and more, at least from my students, that people are willing to push back a bit and say, you know what? No, this is not acceptable. I'm not willing to work that many hours. I'm not willing to do this in this way. The way that you all used to do things is not acceptable to me. And I think that's exactly the message that we need. Is, if you feel like things are missing, we're not doing things right, we're not taking the time to think them through, right? Say it, do it, right? Slow down. And like I said, I know this is easy to say, and you won't always be able to do that. But I think just being aware that A, we need to do it, and B, you actually have a lot more power to do that than you might think. I hope that would at least be one partial step. But I know that's a horribly incomplete answer to a very important question.
Yeah, I think it's tricky to set boundaries when you have low power. And so when we think of our students, trying to set those work-life balances and to protect and advocate for others, it's as you said, a lofty thing to say, a much harder thing to do.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again.